There we go. Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning. Have you ever asked your child to get something, or asked your spouse, or asked a friend to get something for you, and you just can't reach it, and they're like, "Where is it?" You're like, "It is right in front of you." I experience that quite often in life, and it can be frustrating. This morning, I want to explore with you the question, where is God? And sometimes He's oftentimes right in front of you, and you can't even see it. If you'll turn to Genesis chapter 37 as we explore this morning. Genesis 37. As we get there, as you think about where you're going to be after services this morning, as you think about different people that you're going to encounter throughout the week, have this question on the back of your mind, and maybe it can lead you into a discussion with Christ with someone. Where is God in your life? Where is God? As somebody asks, "How are you doing?" Have that on the back of your mind. Where is God in my life? And let that direct your response to them. Sometimes that's a tough question. Where is God when you've lost a husband to cancer? Where is God when you lost your wife to an unexplained aneurysm? Where is God whenever your house burned down and everything in it? All the memories, all the pictures, all your children's toys. Where was God when your business burned down? All your records that you've been keeping for years, down with the dust. Where is God whenever you've gotten into a traumatic automobile accident and you're not able to walk away because you're paralyzed? Where is God whenever Satan takes your child and the world pulls them away from the kingdom? Where is God whenever your sibling was shot and killed by a police officer in his own apartment while eating ice cream? Where is God when? You fill in the blank. These are some tough questions to ask. And maybe the story of Joseph can help us as we explore the question, where is God? And as we think about the presence of God throughout the story of Joseph, and we're not going to look at the fine details of the story of Joseph this morning, but we're going to look at some highlights throughout the narrative as we ask the question, where is God? So in Genesis, the story really kicks off in chapter 37, but before we even get to chapter 37, we're introduced to Joseph all the way back in chapter 30. He's one of Jacob's 12 sons. We see over in chapter 39, in his encounter with Potiphar's wife, that he was handsome in form. He was a good-looking guy. We also know about Joseph that he had several brothers, as we mentioned, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. We also know about Joseph that he was his father's favorite. We see there in chapter 37 that Joseph was favored by his father, and he was even favored by his father to the point where he would get gifts that the rest of his brothers wouldn't get. He gave him a coat, a beautiful coat to wear, to distinguish him from the rest of his brothers. Joseph had a lot going for him. In chapter 37, we also see that Joseph was a teenager. And as we ask the question, where is God's guidance for Joseph? We think about all these characteristics. Because when we think about where God's guidance is throughout these character descriptions of Joseph, we realize that God doesn't really have a guide map for Joseph. I remember back before the times of smartphones and GPS, I had this ginormous atlas. Rand McDonald, I think the name of it was. Some of you might remember. And I tucked that thing away in the corner in between my console and my driver's seat to get from Florida to Arkansas. And I would open that thing up and figure out where I was on the map. Where is God? Joseph didn't have that kind of guide map as he was trying to navigate life. And as we see Joseph in the relationship that he had with his brothers, the relationship that he had with his parents, we realize that Joseph might have been favored by his dad, but not so much by his brothers. Because there in the opening verses of the narrative of Joseph, in chapter 37, verses 2 and 3, we see that even though Joseph was favored by his father and he had this coat of many colors, Joseph was a 17-year-old tattletale. I mean, Joseph's brothers were out doing mischievous things like male siblings do, getting in trouble. And what does Joseph do? He reports back to his old dad. Hey, guess what my brothers were doing? Can you see the annoyance that Joseph was to his brothers? I mean, Joseph was an annoying 17-year-old tattletale boy. And so his brothers hated him for it. And we see throughout the introductory chapter of chapter 37 how exactly Joseph's brothers hated him. Look down in chapter 37 in verse 4. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. They didn't have anything nice to say to Joseph. Look in verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So his brothers hate him for multiple reasons. They look at him as just this dreamer of a kid. They hate him because their father loves them more than they love them. They hate him because he gets Christmas presents that aren't in comparison to the rest of them. So they become very jealous of him. So Joseph has these dreams, multiple dreams, about sheaves bowing down to his sheaf, about the sun, moon, and the stars all bowing down to him. And what is the natural interpretation of these dreams? That one day, all your family is going to bow down to you? His brothers question this. Who is this dreamer? His own dad, Jacob, renamed Israel, looks at Joseph and says, is this to say that your mother and I are going to bow down to you someday, along with the rest of your brothers? And so his brothers hate him more and more. Jump down to verse 11. His brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the saying in mind. Even though his own father, the patriarch Israel, was questioning Joseph, he kept it on the back of his mind while jealousy was rampant among the rest of the brothers. And then we see Joseph's brothers go off in this field beginning in verse 12. And Joseph was commanded to go find his brothers. Again, Joseph doesn't have a map, a Rand McDonald atlas to go find his brothers. And so Joseph is sent by his dad to go find his brothers to report back to him, because Jacob knows that good old Joseph, he'll tell me the truth. And so he sends Joseph out. And so as we question God, where is God's guidance in Joseph? Look at God's providence in this story. Look down in verse 15. Joseph gets kind of lost. He goes to the field around Shechem where he thinks that his brothers are. He can't find them. In verse 15, a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" In the midst of this story where Joseph doesn't have guidance from God, he doesn't have an audible voice from God, we see God's providence working in this random individual. Somewhat random, we might think initially. But you think God is guiding Joseph through his providence, through this one man out in this random field, and this one man out in this random field knows exactly where his brothers went to. And so we can see God's guidance of Joseph, even in this field. And so jump down to verse 18. As Joseph finds his brothers, they see him coming from a distance. And as Joseph's brothers see him coming from the distance, they say, "Oh, here comes the dreamer. Here he comes. I know what we can do. We can throw him into this pit." And they threw him down into this pit. It didn't have any water or anything in it, the text tells us. And their original intention was to kill him. Jealousy had swollen up so much in their heart, they were willing to kill their own sibling. That's how much they hated Joseph. And so as they see some Ishmaelites coming down the way, they're on their way to Egypt. And good old Judah speaks up and says, what profit is it if we kill him? Why do we need to kill him? Let's sell him. Then we can make some money. Let's sell him, and they sold him for a mere 20 shekels of silver. And so as they sell him to these Ishmaelites, Joseph doesn't know what kind of slavery he's getting into. He goes into Egypt a slave, and he doesn't know where God's guidance is. God hasn't given him any kind of a map, and he's wondering, where is God? A question that you might be asking in your own life. Where is God in the situation in which you are currently in life? And so Joseph is on his way down to Egypt, asking, where is God's guidance? You know, I had these dreams, and I thought I knew what they meant. My brothers kind of interpreted them the same way I did. They didn't really like the way that the outcome was. But now I'm a slave? What's going on here? Where is God in all of this? And so as we move on to the next theme in the narrative, we ask the question, where is God's voice to Joseph? Think about this throughout the story of God's people so far. Joseph's great-granddad, Abraham, heard God's voice audibly. God spoke directly to him. Joseph's granddad, Isaac, God has spoken directly to Isaac. And even Joseph's own dad, Jacob, God has verbally, audibly spoken to. But where is God's voice in this story so far? You're not going to find it. God hasn't spoken to Joseph. Why is that? Why hasn't God spoken to Joseph? Where is God's voice to Joseph, who his dad favored, who God is giving him these dreams? And you might make the argument, well, God is speaking to Joseph. He's speaking to him through the avenue of dreams, which, okay, that's fair enough. But God had spoken directly to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet he's not spoken to Joseph. And you also might make the argument, well, Joseph wasn't the oldest of his brothers. Neither was Jacob. Jacob was second Esau, and yet God spoke directly to him. And so where is the voice of God to Joseph in these times of hardship? And so as we go on in the narrative, not only do we see Joseph in slavery, but now he is seen by Potiphar as having God's presence with him. And so as we ask the question, where is the voice of God? Even though it might not be audible to Joseph, we can see the presence of God throughout this story. And so as we ask that question, where is the presence of God? Let's turn over to chapter 39. Chapter 39. As Joseph gets down to Egypt, he's sold into Potiphar's house. We see the situation between Potiphar's wife, and Joseph. And Potiphar's wife is pursuing him day after day, trying to get Joseph to be attracted to her the same way that she's attracted to him, and is trying to tempt Joseph. And time again, Joseph turns away, turns her down. And as we see Joseph in Potiphar's house, we see the presence of God very immediately in this narrative. Look in the first couple of verses of chapter 39. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. Joseph doesn't have direct guidance from God through an audible voice, but we see specifically mentioned in the text that the Lord was with Joseph. Underline that, put a square around it in your Bible. Look in the next verse. Verse 3. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed. And so this theme of the Lord's presence being with Joseph is prevalent throughout this story, from the time he gets into slavery until the time he gets out. Jump down to verse 9. As Potiphar's wife is trying to tempt him, this is what Joseph's response is. He, speaking of Potiphar, he is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything back from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph was hated so much by his brothers that they plotted to kill him. That didn't pan out, so they sold him into slavery. He's now a slave to this slave owner in a foreign land, and yet Joseph acknowledges God's presence. How powerful is that? When life gets so bad, when there is evil, pain, and suffering all around us, we can look to Joseph in the situation in which he was and see that he recognized God's presence even though he was a slave. How can I sin and do this wickedness against God? And as she spoke to him, verse 10, day after day he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. Jump down to verse 21 of that same chapter. Since Joseph wouldn't lie with her, Potiphar's wife takes matters into her own hands and tells Potiphar, he tried to rape me, essentially. He tried to make me sleep with him against my will, and you need to do something about it. So Potiphar throws him into jail. And this is what happens in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph. Underline it. Put a square around it. And showed him steadfast love, loving kindness, some of your versions might say, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And so get this, as Joseph is in prison, verse 23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. Underline it, put a square around it. The Lord was with Joseph time and time again throughout his exile in Egypt. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. The Lord was with Joseph time and time again. Now jump down to chapter 41. As Joseph has been in prison, as he has... Actually, before we get to chapter 41, let's look in chapter 40. As Joseph is in prison, two more people of high regard are thrown into prison. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker. They're thrown in. They start having these dreams. And they ask Joseph, hey, you think you can tell us what these mean? And so Joseph, in verse 8, says this. Or the cupbearer and the baker say this. We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph replied to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Joseph, hated by his brothers, plotted against to be murdered, sold into slavery, falsely accused of rape, thrown into prison for multiple years, and now all of a sudden, I have this ability, but it's not my own. It's from God. We see Joseph recognizing God's presence even in the midst of his prison cell, when all signs point to the fact that God is nowhere to be found. The voice of God is nowhere around. The presence of God, why is it even felt with Joseph? But Joseph recognizes it even in prison. And then in chapter 41, as the cupbearer, just like Joseph had interpreted the dream, gets out of prison, and he's now handing the chalice to Pharaoh himself, the ruler of the world, essentially, the most powerful man in the world. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer remembers, oh, Pharaoh, you're having this dream. I remember this old Canaanite in jail. I had this dream, and everything that he said came to pass. Several years after getting out of prison, he finally remembers Joseph. And so Pharaoh calls Joseph to him and says, all right, I've had these dreams. And you remember the dreams. Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. He has a couple of dreams. One was these fat and skinny cows. What do the fat and skinny cows mean? He has another dream. These ears of corn come out, and some of them are really healthy, and then there's 7 of them that don't look so hot. What do these dreams mean? And so Pharaoh is brought before... it brings Joseph before himself. And this is what Joseph answers in verse 16. Chapter 41 and verse 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Even when Joseph has the opportunity to rise himself, to elevate himself to a position where Pharaoh looks at him as, hey, I could really use him in a position of power. Joseph points his ability back to God. Now also think about this. Who was Pharaoh to the Egyptians? Pharaoh was a god. He was a deity. And here he brings this foreigner from the land of Canaan, and this foreigner is saying, my God can interpret your dreams. In other words, you think you're a god, but my God can interpret what you have dreamed. Joseph is making a bold statement and is recognizing and feeling the presence of God throughout this. And so the story progresses. And we see 2 years into the famine, which this is 7 years after Joseph had been brought before Pharaoh. We see Joseph's brothers. who plotted to kill him, who sold him into slavery, who hated his guts, who was jealous of him, all of a sudden, exactly like Joseph had dreamed, there in Egypt, begging for food because there was famine in the land. And so we see in chapter 45 as this scene unfolds, and Joseph's brothers are there begging for food. And as Joseph had sent his brothers back with food, back to their father, and they ran out of food and they wouldn't come back to Joseph because they had to bring Benjamin, and they just could not bring Benjamin because Jacob wasn't allowing them to. Finally, they convinced Jacob, we have to bring Benjamin, our youngest brother, or else this guy, this ruler of Egypt, isn't going to give us any food. So finally, Jacob gives in, sends Benjamin along. Joseph frames Benjamin for stealing his own chalice, if you remember. Frames him for stealing, puts them all into prison, and Joseph has gone through this whole scandal, framing his brothers, seeing what his brothers would do. And so as Benjamin has been framed for stealing, Judah, the one brother who had decided, I want to kill Joseph, but that's not profitable, so let's sell him into slavery. Remember that, brother? Judah throws himself down at Joseph's feet. And he says, take me instead. Take my life instead. I can't bear the thought of going back to my father and our youngest sibling not being with us. Our father will just die. And so just take my life instead. And so Joseph realizes the change of character, the change of heart, the change of righteousness within his brothers based on this action of Judah. And so look at what Joseph does in chapter 45. Jump down with me to verse 5. This is what Joseph says to them. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, who he is, and says, don't worry about it. God sent me here for a purpose. Down in verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God who sent me here. Joseph recognized God's presence all the way up to this point. And then jump over to chapter 48. Chapter 48, as Jacob is getting ready to pass away, look at what Jacob says, or Israel says to Joseph on his deathbed. Behold, I am about to die. This is chapter 48 and verse 21. Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you. Underline it. Put a square around it. God will be with you. The presence of God is throughout the story. And then turn over to chapter 50. Chapter 50, jump down to verse 19. As Jacob has now passed away, his brothers are naturally probably fearful that Joseph is going to do something drastic like kill them or throw them into the dungeon or put them into slavery. This is what Joseph says to his brothers in verse 19. Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And then on Joseph's deathbed himself, jump down just a few verses to verse 24. Joseph said to his brothers on his deathbed, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he has swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. What do you think this story meant to its original readers? The people that were exiting Egypt centuries later, coming out of slavery, and they were reading this story that Moses was writing down. What do you think it meant to those people that were trying to get out of Egyptian slavery centuries later? This is what I think it meant to those original readers. That God will use the pain and suffering in your life to bring about good. There is a lot of wickedness going on in the world around us. There was a lot of bad things that happened to Joseph, and there's a lot of bad things that have happened in your life this past week that are likely going to happen in your life this coming up week. And I think what the original readers would have gained from this story is that God is going to work with the evil, pain, and suffering around us in this world. And so as we ask the question, where is God in this story? God doesn't speak to us verbally like he did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He doesn't give us a map to say, turn here. We do have his word. But this we can be assured of, and that is that God's presence is with us. And as we read through this scripture, we ask the question, where is God? you're not alone in asking that question, where is God? You think about Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus himself asked that question while he was on the cross. And so for us to ask God, my God, where are you? It is an okay question to ask. God is a big God. But as we consider God's presence, we can't neglect to look at Romans chapter 8. As Paul is writing to the Romans chapter 8, underline this if it's not already. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28 as we close. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So as you ask the question, and keep the question on the back of your mind this week, where is God? If you will only remember one thing about this lesson, if you'll only remember one thing, let it be this: God is with you wherever you go. Joseph didn't hear the audible voice of God. He didn't have a guide map, but God was with him wherever he went. And if you want to have that presence of God in your life, you can tap into that presence through the sacrifice that Christ made for us on the cross. And you can have that ultimate and ongoing presence in whatever stage of life you are if you have clothed yourself with Christ and you've had your sins washed away and you've tapped into his death, his burial, and his resurrection. But that's the only way that you can have access to God. That's the only way that you can have his presence. There's only one way to God, and it is through Christ. And if you want to have that presence this morning, then you can have that. Or maybe you've been asking the question, where is God? And you need the church's help in redirecting you, in re-establishing your faith in him, in recognizing that he is with you wherever you are. If we can help you in any way, please come us together. Please stand and sing.
Good in the night with my head held